Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on Episode 5 of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. If you like to watch along, then start watching now. So, this episode, things start off kind of ghoulishly in my mind. David is dealing with the prospect of using those cyber hands that Pilar had before he died. And, David's sort of saying, they're not really his style, which is kind of fair. But on the other hand, he's being kind of presumptuous by saying, when Maine kicks the bucket, he'd prefer his augmetics instead. And I guess from my perspective, it's pretty easy to say this whole thing is ghoulish, seeing as how the sudden violent death of friends or coworkers isn't really something I have to deal with. And even if it was, I don't know, I don't think I would immediately start rooting through their possessions. So I guess some of this just really goes to show that inhumanity, or I guess a lack of humanity is sort of the norm in Night City. And if that weren't bad enough, from Kiwi's perspective as a netrunner, it seems that this whole Tanaka business is still not going well. He's beefed up security. That Grand Theft Auto thing really set the whole team back. Now this is actually kind of interesting, it's only just sort of coming to everyone's attention that David went to Arasaka and knew Tanaka's son. It's not like they were friends or anything, but that there's, I guess, a personal connection. I feel like if nothing else, if you guys are a bunch of edgerunners, which is to say mercenaries and borderline criminals, maybe having a personal connection to essentially the target of your scheme, that's not good, If nothing else, it's something that could trace things back to you if you're trying to be sneaky about things. So it's interesting that there's seemingly another angle they can go about this. David knows a guy who basically makes brain dances. And this guy and Tanaka are, I guess, associated. So it would seem as though they could use this guy to get to Tanaka. And the thing I think is really interesting about this brain dance business is that it seems like the stuff this JK guy is doing is maybe not illicit, but definitely unsavory. You know, it's not like something you could just sort of stumble upon under normal circumstances. You have to go and find it. But more than that, you know, he can tailor it to your personal experiences. Which, I don't know, there's not really an analog for something like that I'm aware of. You know, it would be like, I guess, like a choose-your-own-adventure book that was written specifically for you, but I don't know, that's kind of a bit of a stretch. So even though this all sort of happened pretty quickly, it seems like Main and company have an in here. You know, if they can grab this guy, they can use him to get at Tanaka, and hopefully, you know, everything will go to plan. However, there's a saying, I think it was General MacArthur, I believe he said something to the effect of, you know, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy. So, you know, you might have a good plan, but, you know, paper and the real world are two different things. And, you know, it seems like the crux of this plan sort of rests on David basically distracting this guy by pretending to be a fan. I mean, maybe he doesn't need to pretend, strictly speaking, but he definitely has to lay it on a bit thick. Unfortunately for David and Maine, you know, this guy's a bit more wary than perhaps they were giving him credit for. And even more interesting, you know, he seemed to have just basically slapped everybody with an EMP, which, you know, seeing as how everybody has all sorts of cybernetics, I'd imagine that's a far more potent threat than it would initially seem. Because, you know, basically the way an EMP works is it releases a burst of highly energetic electrons, basically, and they impart energy into cybernetics and, well, electronics in general. And the idea is it induces larger currents than things are rated for, thus burning them out. So, you know, it's a good way to ruin a lot of electronics permanently. And if those electronics are sort of like integrated into your body, and they're not, you know, shielded or otherwise made resilient, that's decidedly not good. So that's interesting. You know, a little bit of analysis seems to indicate that this was like not just an EMP, but a special one, I guess tuned specifically to dab on Netrunners. And, you know, if you do have people sort of bobbing in and out of the net and doing stuff, it would make sense that you would create countermeasures to deal with that. So unfortunately for David, you know, he got dragged to who knows where by this guy, and seeing the kind of stuff this guy's pumped out, you know, it's only reasonable to perhaps assume that, you know, some of the stuff he does isn't necessarily relegated only to BDs, as certainly seems to be the case, you know. Although seeing as how things are, I don't know, kind of, not non-linear, but there seem to be a couple like non-sequitur type things here. You know, David didn't have a gun, now he does. Seems to me that this is not exactly reality. And I think, this sequence right here, this is basically very similar to that bit at the beginning with the lieutenant colonel who had the Sandevistan before getting slotted by Max Tack. I mean, assuming that this is in fact not real, I'd imagine this is a highly potent BD. I mean, one can only imagine just how horrifying something like this would be, especially if it's tuned to you. Whatever that means. Like, it's something that's made even more potent based on, like, neural chemistry or physiology. I mean, unless David's been getting a couple more augmetics that we haven't seen, he doesn't have one of those mantis blades. So it's pretty clear that this isn't reality. But even so, like, that's gotta be, pretty unsettling. I mean, I've certainly had dreams that were very, very lifelike, and they ended up not being real, but, there was, like, a couple minutes upon waking up where it's like, did any of that really happen? And, you sort of have to, like, think through it. Although in David's case, this isn't a dream per se, but this is sort of something he's being forced to experience. I'm almost reminded somewhat of, like the Emperor's Children from Warhammer 40,000. They are hedonists to such extreme degrees that something like experiencing your own death, just for the sheer novelty of it, is something that's not beyond the pale for them. And that's sort of what this guy's talking about, isn't it pretty nifty to experience your own death? And frankly, I'd imagine that the answer is no. I think I'd rather not do that, Alright, so this guy's feeding us a little bit of interesting lore here. He's making the point that, isn't it curious how he gets all this footage? Well, it turns out a lot of military-grade stuff has basically the recorders built in, and if you know the right people, you can get the raw footage. So, even if the military had designed the Sandevistan, there's definitely some people of such flexible morality that they would essentially sell off classified information. It shouldn't really come as a surprise that this would be the case, but I do think it makes for an effective revelation, seeing as how, the corruption of the military isn't something that had really been rubbed in our face so far. Because, that lieutenant colonel went off the deep end, but that wasn't necessarily something they were hoping for. Presumably they were hoping he could handle the thing, and then they'd have, a super soldier with the Sandevistan, but that ended up not being the case. So fortunately, Lucy is a bit more quick on the draw here. You don't want that guy setting off another EMP, so they have to take, I guess, precautions to make sure he doesn't do anything untoward. Unfortunately, David's still sort of in that BD, which, that's not good for anybody, really. Now, I do think this guy is awfully smug considering the situation he's in. Although he is right that if they were here to kill him, they would have done so already. So, I guess there's solace in that, but he seems awfully smug for a guy with a gun pointed to his head. So unfortunately, it seems like only part of the gang is here. And seeing as how there's now 2 fully armed bulletproof drones, the odds aren't looking particularly rosy for David and company here. I mean, honestly, at this point, their best bet would be to, in all likelihood, have Lucy hack them, but I don't really know too much about how the game mechanics work, but I would imagine that things are taking just enough time so as to be dramatic and advantageous for writing. In-game, I'd imagine it's like basically a skill check or a small series of skill checks. It wouldn't take too much time in-game, but, that's not cool. What's cool is having David use his Sandevistan stand to run around and shoot things. And you know what? That's true. It is cool. So, I guess I'll give it a pass, Yeah, it is kind of unfortunate that this guy is ultimately correct, that, they do want to question him, so as nice as it would be to just, put a couple holes in him, it would not work to anyone's advantage. So it seems like they've managed to get him to acquiesce. They've done it off screen, which I think is fair. But yeah, I guess he knows what's good for him. It wouldn't do to go through all this and then get shot for insubordination. He does also sort of frame it as he doesn't really have much of a choice. And that's fair as well, Like, there's that whole recurring bit about you can't trust anybody in Night City. I guess in this case that's not entirely true. He could trust that they would kill him. And, he can't necessarily trust that they won't kill him when all this is done, but, if they're willing to let him live for now, you might as well go with it. So I think this conversation is kind of interesting in that it sort of echoes David's conversation with the Ripper Doc from earlier. Basically, like, you're a kid with that Sandevistan, this ultimately can't end well. And David's sort of just going back to, well, I feel like I'm special, it's not affecting me poorly, so, there's gotta be something to that. And I guess, to a degree, he is correct, but at the same time, there are no happy endings in Night City, so even if David is better on some base physiological level, then I guess really the only thing he can do is achieve greater heights before ultimately succumbing or dying or what have you. So unfortunately, it seems like the plan has hit a snag. Tanaka doesn't want the BD tuned to him. His son's getting released from the hospital, so he just wants the standard edit. And even though Kurosaki is trying to, convince him otherwise, Main has decided to just sort of intervene. You know, there's no point in messing with this pretense any further. I feel like perhaps it was a bit rash to do something like this, but you know, the netrunners on the team have blocked any outgoing calls. Everybody's got guns pointed at Tanaka. I guess it makes sense that Tanaka would have weapons systems of some sort. You know, he's not totally defenseless. But I don't think it would be reasonable for him to be able to beat up everybody unscathed. Granted, it's not like they want to kill him or anything. You know, at least not yet. It's kind of unclear what precisely they want with him. Yeah, you know, it's rather unfortunate. Kurosaki was willing to help Main and crew, and in the end he caught a needle to the neck and bled out. It is rather unfortunate, but, you know, the dude was kind of a jerk. Unfortunately, you know, the fact that he died is, you know, it's something that might require a bit of outside attention that the team wouldn't necessarily want. I mean, like, Trauma Team, they're, I guess, like, basically glorified ambulance drivers, but they also have guns, which makes them kind of dangerous in their own right. It's one of those things that's really interesting, because they'll go around and shoot and kill, but at the same time, you know, if the client's dead, then what do they care? You know, that's it. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.